If we leveled up the health of the north of England to national averages, that would create an extra £13 billion on its own in terms of GBA. What's the best intervention we can do for someone's health? Over the long term, it's going to be good housing, a good job.
Which postcode you're in should not determine your life expectancy, should it? But it
does. It absolutely does. And I think until people start to zoom out of it, we're going to have all these unintended consequences.
Welcome back to The Digital Forge. This is part 2 of my conversation with Richard Stubbs. In part 1, we explored the mechanics of NHS innovation, AI, and the risks of opportunities of digital healthcare. In this episode, we move upstream. This is about economics, regional power, inequality, and why Richard believes the future prosperity of Britain is directly tied to the health of its population. Welcome back, Richard. I have to say, I really enjoyed part 1. You were so candid and honest about the state of the NHS, the possibilities of the NHS. It was really, really personally fascinating for me, and I'm sure our listeners as well. So you've become one of the strongest advocates for the idea that health and economic growth are really inseparable. So what do you mean when you say health is the new wealth?
Yeah, so I think there are all sorts of ways in which health can promote economic growth. I think, just think about the NHS for a minute. We are a massive economic engine in our own right. It's the 5th largest organisation in the world, depending on how you cut it.
Really?
Yeah, 1.4 million staff here. I think it depends on how you judge things like McDonald's and Walmart. But let's say we're definitely comfortably in the top 10. Most places outside the Greater Southeast, the NHS is probably going to be the biggest employer in your local town or city. And of course, we're a massive procurer of goods and services as well. So, the NHS is in itself an economic engine. But the more important piece here is, of course, the productivity, the health of the nation. And I think we're starting now more and more to think about the NHS as a national investment in our health rather than maybe a cost, to our tax pounds. We did some work actually last year with a great company called Frontier Economics, and they calculated that if we actually adopted health innovation throughout the country, there's a £278 billion productivity gain for the country in terms of just uplifting people's health outcomes. And most of that is about productivity. Most of that is about keeping people in work, helping people back into work. There's a little bit around foreign direct investment as well, but most of it is about how can the NHS be that kind of productivity engine, keeping people in work.
My experience of medicine for half my life, just shy of half my life, was in the United States, which is all private healthcare. And in the US, they refer to it as socialized medicine. Mm-hmm. And the nomenclature is interesting because it implies socialist. So having a national health service is a socialist ideal. I remember having a conversation with someone once and saying he was complaining about this, socialized medicine, and how can you guys in the UK have an NHS? And it's like, well, as a business owner, I've got to pay an average health insurance cost per employee was $2,500 per month. Mm. I mean, you can't even make up how expensive it is. And I said, if somebody gets sick, I've got to pay for them. I've got to pay for them to be off work. I've got to pay for their healthcare. So it's maybe the idea of the NHS is actually a capitalist ideal because it's keeping our workforce. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's the backbone of our society.
It absolutely is. It's the safety net of our society. Now, we do have to flip this. I think one of the biggest shifts we're trying to do in the NHS is to move from sickness to prevention. And I think that is the thing that's really going to, kickstart this kind of productivity drive. Because, if we're honest at the moment, the model is, you break and then we'll try and fix you. And it's a really expensive way to go about things. But actually, thinking about how you reimagine even where health and healthcare is delivered, we need to deliver healthcare in our places of work. We need to deliver healthcare in our schools. The NHS, yes, of course, will always be there. But I think thinking about how we use healthcare as a preventative tool I think, is how we're really going to link this health wealth axis together.
And from a practical perspective, how do you implement some of those things? What is preventative healthcare? How does it work?
Yeah, preventive healthcare. I mean, it's funny enough, right now in Sheffield, in South Yorkshire, we've got it's one of the things that we're really going after. This thing about the prevention economy. How do you actually, because we talk about it all the time, and if you look at any government document around health for the last 20, 30 years, you will say, we need the left shift. We've never done it. And actually, you look at where most money goes into in the NHS, it goes into hospitals. So first of all, I think it's about acknowledging that the system we've got is the system we've got, and we're going to have to radically shift resources if we're going to actually make a shift on that needle. And where do those resources have to go? Those resources have to go more upstream. We have to be able to meet people where they're at, in their homes, in their communities, in their workplaces. And we have to think more about what are the interventions we need to do earlier in order to prevent people from falling out of work, falling out of education, becoming long-term sick, becoming a burden in terms of welfare payments, etc. But that's really, I think, work that's now on the way. There's a guy called, Charlie Mayfield. So Charlie Mayfield, he's got a great piece of work around Keep Britain Working. And that's all about this. Now, it's all about what's the role of employers? What's the responsibility of employers when it comes to providing, or at least buying into, health services, so that we can tackle the things that keep people out of work. Because we know what they are. It's mental health, it's musculoskeletal issues, it's cardiovascular issues. We need to target the things that prevent people from staying in work, and be more mindful and specific about where we place the interventions so that those people can get treatments faster.
One of the discussions that I seem to have a lot with various people is, you talked about mental health and affecting people's ability to go to work. There's one of the largest factors is anxiety. Mm-hmm. Now, when I was growing up, nobody really, if you said I'm anxious, they'd say just get on with it or whatever. Has this always been? Is this a factor of modern society? Is it because of social media? What is going on with that? I genuinely don't understand it.
No, and neither do I. And it's not for me to answer. Somebody's not. I'm not a mental health physician by any means. I think all I'd say is you kind of look at the challenge in front of you, and the challenge in front of you is that it is absolutely up there. Mental health issues, particularly with younger generations, are up there as a reason why people can't work.
Yeah.
And so I think our job as leaders is to think, well, how do we meet that challenge? How do you meet that challenge in an ethical, moral way that allows people to be the best version of themselves? And I think that has to be about providing them with the tools, providing them with the interventions that are going to make the biggest difference to their outcomes.
So this health wealth gap I was looking up last night is costing Britain about £180 billion annually. Do politicians understand this? Because that is a massive proportion of our GDP.
It is. And I think that increasingly, yes. I think if you look at, there's some really interesting stuff that's happening around, this notion of productivity, health, work, being out of work over the long term. Right here in South Yorkshire, I almost feel like an epicenter for some of the good practice. Alan Milburn did a great piece of work in Barnsley called Pathways to Work. Talks about Charlie Mayfield and the work he's doing. We're very involved in that here. So I think it's really understood. And then, but then also, for me, it's about shifting the perspective so that it doesn't become about a cost, but it becomes about an offer. So just across the north of England, for instance, if we leveled up the health of the north of England and our population to national averages, that would create an extra £13 billion on its own in terms of GBA. And that's just about, going after our northern population. So, and that's not about better NHS services. The NHS services across the north of England are as good as, if not better than, services elsewhere in the country. So I'm not talking here about we need better hospitals, we need better ambulances, faster ambulances. It's actually about saying it's our health, not our healthcare. It's about saying, how do you take people on that journey of being a healthier population, makes them more productive, ability to stay in work longer, £13 billion back to the UK PLC. And that's the kind of argument that we need to be making to places like the Treasury about why we need greater investment in our health infrastructure.
How do you get access to that 13 billion? What practical programs need to be put in place to make that happen?
And as I said, I think it's preventative. It's looking at the core areas, going after the biggest bits of the pie chart about the reasons why people fall out of work or struggle to get back into work. And, mental health is on there and musculoskeletal is on there, particularly around, heavily industrial or manufacturing areas such as, we found across the north, musculoskeletal issues are key, bad backs, warehouses, etc. So, but it is about not waiting for people to fall out. And actually, this is where AI and data in particular has a massive role to play. I'm working with a couple of companies now who are telling me that they're going to be able to predict to an individual level employees who are likely to fall out of work due to ill health and be on long-term sick. And they're going to have like a 9-month lens of being able to spot those individuals. That then allows an employer or the NHS or both to then be proactive in terms of the support package you can put around that person, keeping them in work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, instead of looking at this as a sledgehammer, we need to be a bit more scalpel.
Yeah.
And I think data AI gives us the tools to be pretty laser focused at this.
With preventative health, one of the bigger questions is who pays. And I know you're doing a lot of work with Westfield around workplace wellbeing. What can employers do in this area? Because it strikes me that, that example you just gave, it as an employer, former employer actually, I would want to know that I could keep my workforce together, that I could keep them productive. I mean, what can employers do here?
And I think there's some great examples. There's some particularly larger companies who get this and they get the business case. So I think first of all you've got to think, well, what's your rationale for moving on this? Why should you? And the obvious bit here, isn't it, is about recruitment and retention. It's about taking away the friction, taking away the cost to a business. So there's an obvious argument about the why. Not every employer is going to be able to afford to have in-house the kind of facilities, the kind of interventions that you'll need in order to be able to cater for a workforce. The big boys will, always, and that's great. And you mentioned about Westfield, there are other examples out there, particularly in London, those blue chip companies who invest heavily, not just in gyms, but in, mental health, diagnostics, other types of interventions that allow people to be the best versions of themselves because they get that it's good for their own bottom line. They get that it's good for their productivity. But, we're a region of small to medium enterprises. We need to be able to, I think, pool together and think about how we're going to be able to provide facilities where SMEs and others can buy a share in those kind of facilities, not necessarily public sector, not necessarily the NHS facilities, but then allow their employees to be able to benefit from that.
When you've been talking, my brain's going and I'm going, I've owned companies, run companies, managed companies. Nobody's ever sort of said to me, here's a training. You need to go and get trained on this stuff. This is really important. And the reason you need to go and get training is because it's got this economic advantage. Most employers, when you connect the economic value of something to an objective, will do it.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the type of thing that needs to happen?
It absolutely does need to happen. And I think also government are thinking very hard about standards as well.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be a bit of a stick and a bit of a carrot. I mean, the carrot is obviously bottom line productivity, without a doubt. And I think that will shift a lot of people's attention. But then you've got to give them the blueprint about the how. And, you don't want people to have to then, back to my NHS points about invention, this is not going to be about invention. This is going to be about saying, here are the proven interventions that work. The reason why people fall out of work, as I said, there's some real commonalities there. So let's go after MSK, let's go after mental health. But then ultimately government can then come on the back of that with a level of standards and expectations. And maybe even hopefully, I would say hopefully some incentives, some bottom line financial incentives to do it. But then we've got to create the conditions. We've got to create the environment. We've got to make sure that this isn't just going to be about the large employers. And you've got to be able to say, well, what does an SME, what does a 5-man SME do? Who's got an owner, founder, who's absolutely wanting to do the right thing for their employees, but actually doesn't have to worry at all. So I think there's going to have to be a market created.
Yeah.
And people will be able to opt into various schemes.
Well, we have done this in other aspects, like, for example, energy use but it strikes me that you could implement a program that would arguably be more important or as important as the environmental factors for people's well-being and health.
Yeah.
And I wonder why we've never done it.
It's a good question, but then why? When it comes to prevention, you can look across a whole range of society and see, why are we building roads without cycle lanes?
I know.
You could go and go and go. I think ultimately we have not put enough attention on well-being as an objective of public sector endeavour. And I think when you start to think about health in all policies, health in all investment, some of these decisions I think become pretty obvious, but I don't think they've been obvious to us previously.
Yeah, when you put it like this, it's obvious. I mean, we just need to be doing it. I mean, it's actually looking after ourselves, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, who would say no? We did a piece of work around workplace wellbeing in the NHS. This was about 12 years ago, and we did it locally in some of our local hospitals. And we took some methodologies that a university had produced. We kind of applied it to NHS staff. We gave them a set of interventions over a period of time, and as you'd imagine, found a step change both in terms of the reduction in absence rates, but also the reduction in presenteeism as well, which was fantastic. What was really interesting to me, and has always stuck out to me, is the viral effect on those staff members' families. So as that staff member went through this kind of change, this kind of help and support and advice and guidance, they took all that learning home. And actually, it started to seep into the family.
Yeah. And
I think when you start thinking about it like that, you start thinking, so if we start providing employer-led healthcare interventions, what's the ripple effect? What's the ripple effect if we start to do this in our schools with our kids, and our kids start to take this home? So I think, there's a real opportunity, I think, to shift a generation in terms of not just why you should do it, but how to do it as well.
I mean, as you've been talking, I was thinking to myself, if you go back 20 years, nobody would have been off due to mental health.
Yeah.
Nobody would have admitted that that's what they were doing. Now, I'm not saying it's very common, but people do that, which is actually, that is a step change, isn't it? That is the beginning of what sort of needs to happen next. So people are admitting that they are suffering from mental health issues. And the next step is then, okay, how do we prevent that from happening? And a lot of these things are work related, aren't they? I mean, it does happen in the workforce. Super, super interesting. So you've argued that the next industrial revolution in Britain could be driven through health innovation and life sciences. Why Yorkshire?
Why not Yorkshire?
Exactly.
Yorkshire's, I mean, my day job is to bang the drum for Yorkshire. So obviously I would say that, but I say that with a huge degree of evidence. I mean, I think you look across Yorkshire, particularly I think across, some of our core cities, Leeds, Sheffield, some of the stats are incredible. We are the medtech capital of the country. There's no doubt about that. Leeds has, 23% of all digital health jobs are in the Leeds city region.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
We have more health and life science companies in Yorkshire than Oxford and Cambridge combined. Now, the capitalisation of those companies compared to Oxford and Cambridge is a different conversation, but the assets are there. What we need to do, I think, is be more aware, first of all, bang the drum harder, be better ambassadors of all this stuff, but also shout louder, I think, in terms of investment and infrastructure in particular. I don't know if you know where the Crick Centre, just outside St Pancras.
Yeah.
We put more money into the Crick every year than we put across the entire research and innovation landscape of the north of England. So there's a rebalancing that needs to happen. But the argument, I think, is very strong that despite that lack of investment, there's some really, really compelling reasons why the north of England is leading the way when it comes to health and life sciences.
Britain's had this. We do exceptional academic research. I see so much of it from Northern Great Britain, particularly actually the University of Sheffield and the MRC and other places. But we're often not very good at taking that research and prosecuting it, commercialising it. Why is that?
I think, well, certainly in the NHS, my experience has been that we're not as geared up as we should be to have a kind of an entrepreneurial culture within the NHS. I think it's getting a lot better. And I think there are some notable national pieces of work. There's a friend of mine, Professor Tony Young, who for years now has led what's called the Clinical Entrepreneurs Program. That's been phenomenal at exactly creating the kind of the culture, the pathways, the mentorship, all the kind of ingredients that you need. But equally, and this is, some years ago now, but I've been in rooms where clinicians with phenomenal ideas have effectively been told you can be a doctor or an entrepreneur, but you can't be both, pick one. And they've taken that idea and they've gone to California and, they're doing very well. Thank you very much. So we need to be better at this. And I think that is now really understood. So the question has to be how. I think in places like ours, sat here in Sheffield as we are today, I'm not sure we've got yet the entrepreneurial culture in a deep-seated way. And I think we need to think about how we create that, how we inject that, how we give people permission to be entrepreneurs, how we give permission for people to fail. I think particularly in the North, we need to think about access to finance, access to capital. So there's a lot of ingredients that are missing. But for me, it starts off with, are the kids in our region growing up thinking that they want to be founders or not? And I'd say we're not there yet.
It's interesting. It has been, if you look at professors at Stanford, in California, University of Stanford, they are actively encouraged to go and start businesses and told, go away, do it, and you can come back. There's always going to be a role for you. Is that beginning to happen in the NHS? Oh, no.
Not really. I mean, I'm sure it is in pockets. I mean, and there are some exceptional clinical entrepreneurs in the NHS and just outside the NHS as well. But no, I wouldn't say it's the culture at all. And, I spent a lot of time in the States, not as much as you, but I've been over there a few times and to some of the great ecosystems, whether it's Boston or California or Texas, actually. And I get what you're saying, that actually, if you're a leading clinician in the States and you're not working with industry, you're perhaps greeted with a bit of suspicion. Whereas I think probably the opposite is true in the UK. It's
kind of what you said in the first episode of this, when you said, you went for a job and they offered to pay you a sandwich. Yeah. It's just not feasible for you to go and do that job. If you say to, a clinician who's got a brilliant idea for some diagnostic software or whatever it is, well, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to give up your job, and you've got no chance, pal. They're not going to do it, and that is probably the biggest stifle to innovation, isn't it? It's that, and then if you mentioned capital as well. Are you seeing more venture be interested in this area? Are you forming, and do you think that there's a space like they have done with Northern Gritstone to create a fund that's ultimately funded by some institutions and family offices, but mainly from government, to fund this stuff?
Yeah, there is, and I think we're looking at, certainly in the macro level, NHS, some big conversations, some big moves now about creating a couple of funds. 150 million quid fund just announced the other day. Yeah. So it's starting to happen. It's starting to bubble, I'd say. But we're in the foothills. We're thinking very hard about how we bring more of that up here.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly important to us. We have a lot of IP here that's in need of capital. And what we don't want is them, on a train down to London, or heaven forbid, on a plane. So it's starting to happen, I would say. I think globally, if a life science chief exec was in the room now, they would almost certainly say the problem with the NHS as it's seen globally is it's seen as slow and low, slow to uptake, low uptake. And so therefore it's seen as a great test bed, a great sandpit. But ultimately the growth, the product, the scaling is going to happen elsewhere. And I think that's the bit where the NHS needs to understand its place in the ecosystem. It needs to understand that actually we need to have a strong, vibrant life science sector in this country, and the NHS therefore needs to be a market for that in order to be globally competitive, and it is a very competitive market now.
So we've got a great university here in Sheffield, the University of Sheffield, which produces a lot of super interesting research. We've spun out a couple of companies now from there, and you've recently become a visiting professor at the University of Sheffield. Congratulations. So what role do universities in general play in fixing this gap?
Yeah, I think they're really important, aren't they? I think, we think about we've got some great universities in Yorkshire. Oftentimes, I'm coming, from an inward investment point of view. Let's look at that. We've got a great product that we've been delivering for many years about bringing companies into the UK to introduce them to the NHS market. But crucially, I think for the north of England, we're not taking them into London, Cambridge, and Oxford. We're bringing them into the north of England and saying that actually this is the place to operate. And if you look at places like Leeds, which is one of the places where we're bringing those companies in, it's the university infrastructure that's absolutely got to be the attractive, compelling sell as to why. So, Leeds has Nexus, it has other parts of its infrastructure. Understanding how the universities are then set up to be able to help a company to do further research, to spin out, to have grow on space, all those, incubator space, all those kind of things I think are absolutely fundamental to how attractive we are to the inbound market. And I think it's often underestimated, I think, in terms of the roles universities play in that space.
We've got some interesting assets here, like the AWRC, the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, and Sheffield Olympic Legacy Park. And we've obviously got Teaching Hospital here as well. Just talk a little bit about that ecosystem that you see that we have here in Sheffield, and what could happen.
Yeah, what could happen? I think we're at the start of a really exciting journey if we get it right. I think you mentioned those assets. There's literally, the National Centre for Child Health Technology is going up as we speak. That's going to be another really important string to our bow. Ultimately, we've got to use all these assets to tell a better story about our region. And I think we've got to understand what our calling card is going to be. One of the things that we are, perhaps, I used to be a chair of this local enterprise partnership in South Yorkshire. And when you worked across the north of England, every region always said it's great at everything, which isn't very helpful. I think one of the things that South Yorkshire has to do more of, and we're creating an academic health partnership to help us with this conversation, is to think, so what are genuinely our strengths, and what's the attractiveness of those strengths commercially? I think it's going to be about wellbeing and prevention. I think, the ship has sailed on, things like pharma, other types of parts of the clinical pathway, but I don't think anyone's yet cracked this idea of having an ecosystem that's all about genuine prevention. And I think when you look at National Centre for Child Health Technology, all about great start in life. You look at the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, moving more, healthy aging, etc. How do we make sure that this region is known not just by the people who live here, but our government and internationally, as that's the place where prevention is being born?
Yeah, in Sheffield, I don't know if it's still the case, you are going to know this, but the difference in health outcomes expectation between the East and West, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's 10, 12 years.
Oh,
yeah.
How can that be the case?
It's the same. In most cities you go to, there will be a bus route. And some people always mention the bus route and say, from one end of the patch to the other end of the patch, there's going to be a differential in life by a decade or more. And crucially, I suppose, these days as well, not just talking about life expectancy in its purest form, but also talking about healthy years. So, what is the time in a person's life when on average they're likely to get chronic comorbidities, and I think that's also something that we need to pay heed to, because, people are going into ill health in their early 50s or their late 70s, depending on, their level of affluence. So, health inequalities, or inequalities in general, is endemic within society.
I mean, this is a rabbit hole, I know, but what actually is it? Diet? Is it lifestyle? Is it smoking? Is it drinking? Is it that doctors are better in the West than they are in the East?
No, it's all those things and none of those things. I've got a friend of mine, Professor Habib Naqvi. He runs the Race and Health Observatory in the NHS. And if Habib was here today, he'd talk about the causes of the causes.
Yeah.
So yes, it's diet, it's exercise, it's drinking.
Yeah.
It's poor sleep. It's lack of access to green spaces.
Yeah.
But it's those things because people are doing 3 jobs, and it's those things because people live in parts of the city that don't have access to green spaces. So the causes of the causes, I think, are where we have to target. So you have to look at affluence, distribution of income, the big ticket things that we know about that are, perhaps over here on a shelf marked too hard. But until we start leaning into those problems, we might be addressing some symptoms, but we're not really addressing the causes.
Yeah, it's more obvious in the US actually. When you're driving in the US and you go, my son was at university up in Portland. When we drive from San Francisco up to Portland, the bits in between, some of the bits were low income areas, and the only food, if you wanted to stop to get something to eat, it was McDonald's, Burger King, Pizza Hut, Kentucky Fried Chicken type of places. You couldn't actually get decent food, and if you go somewhere like Spain, it's one of the reasons I really like it is because you don't have to be wealthy to eat really well.
Yeah.
And in the UK, I think we're somewhere in between.
Yeah,
aren't we? And it's it just shouldn't be which postcode you're in. Should not determine your life expectancy, should it? But it
does. It absolutely does. And I think what compounds that is that we often, I think, address those communities in our silos rather than thinking about a holistic approach to that. So as the NHS thinking about our approach to certain postcodes, local government doing the same. I think as you move toward more kind of a place-based approach, I think thinking about holistically, how do you support communities who are most in need, I think will be a route to go.
Really, really interesting, and it's good that a spotlight is shone on this. And obviously, you do a lot of other things in the community as well. You sit on boards covering schools, theatres, economic growth, health innovation, universities, and you've described yourself as a knitter in chief.
Yeah, very grandly.
So what do you mean by that, first of all?
Yeah, what do I mean by that? I mean, I stumbled into what's become a bit of a philosophy, or I suppose a rule book of mine in terms of my career, which is doing the job that I do is a real privilege. It's one of the few jobs in the NHS that probably has a bit of headspace. And I kind of worked out that, again, accidentally, that there are loads of people in loads of different rooms across this city and every city who are trying to do the same job that I'm doing, but perhaps in a different way, calling it a different thing, different terminology, etc. And so that really for me happened when I joined the local enterprise partnership. And as I saw everything that was happening in the LEP as a health intervention. But actually the NHS wasn't in the room, which astounded me. And I was only there by accident. I wasn't there as an official NHS person, but I was there going, that's health, that's health, that's health. New roads, new access to skills, new jobs. And I started to realize that, hey, there's quite a lot of people who are doing health, if you like. And I thought, well, that's an interesting place to try and guide people, I suppose, help to kind of bring the whole thing together. I hate duplication in life in general. I see my role in education as a health intervention. So that kind of started to snowball, really. And I started to realize that actually, particularly in a place like South Yorkshire, it can feel quite fragmented. And so you need, I think, a few connectors. You need a few people who are able to bridge those different silos and try and align those ducks, try and get us all kind of, singing from the same hymn sheet. And I've been lucky enough, I think, to be given a few roles in this city in particular that's allowed me to do a bit of that.
It's interesting. Just explain a little bit how you said roads and other things that were actually connected to health. Just explain how they're connected.
Yeah, so it goes back to this kind of growth, health and wealth piece. What's the best intervention we can do for someone's health? Well, over the long term, it's going to be good housing, a good job, someone to love, good strong social relationships, good education. So from a healthcare point of view, the best thing I can do for my citizens is to give them access to all that. And sometimes the way to give them access to that is through good transport links. I know of situations where, apprentices in this city have had to give up their apprenticeship because the bus route that gets them to work stopped. And all of a sudden you're back to the situation of, for the want of a bus route two people have fallen out of what could have been an incredibly exciting start of a career path because they can no longer get the 7 miles to get to that place. And yet nothing's joined up, nobody's cancelled a bus route and thought that's a negative impact on our prosperity and our health. They're just cancelling a bus route. And I think until people start to zoom out a bit, we're going to have all these unintended consequences.
It's really interesting. I'd never really made those connections, and possibly because we live in a bubble over here, of course. Just move on to you've written and spoken very openly about race, leadership and white privilege inside institutions. So let's just sort of go back to the beginning of this. What is it like for a black man working in some of the institutions that you've had to work in, and growing up in a very traditional community, in a mining community? Because somebody just wouldn't. I have to admit my own biases. I wouldn't have assumed that you were from a mining community.
Yeah,
for example.
Yeah, not many people do, and I think, the growing up thing is really fascinating, but only in retrospect. Because as I said previously, every day was normal. When it's your normal, it's your normal. I was the only black kid in my comprehensive school of 1,500 kids.
Are you serious?
Yeah, but that was.
What is that like?
Now it feels weird, but back then, that's just the way it was. It was, really strange. Obviously, don't get me wrong. Was there racism? Of course there was racism. Was there overt racism? Yes, of course there was overt racism. Was it huge? No, not really, actually. Although, I'm N equals 1 on this particular experiment. But it certainly shaped me, and it made me incredibly resilient, and it made me, want to have, so I can see the parts of me as a person, as a human being, that were shaped by that upbringing. But, when you're in it, you don't really realize that's what you're going through. But, you can certainly look back and say, I can see how that bit of me has been informed by this or by that. So that's really interesting. But as I said at the time, it was perfectly normal, and actually probably was a good primer for my professional career, because I'm, often but not always the only black person in the room, which is perfectly normal. I'm perfectly fine with, and not an uncomfortable fact at all. What I often toy with in my mind is if the races were reversed and there was a single white chief executive in a room full of black people, I'm pretty sure they'd notice. And I'm pretty sure it'd probably be the first thing that they'd say when they went home that night is, you would believe, I had a very interesting experience today, good or bad, who knows? But it's funny how used to it you get. But in terms of, I suppose, the institutions, it's been an interesting journey for me. I started off life thinking I wouldn't have to get into racial politics. And I think it was only when I started to realize that actually it probably wasn't about what I thought and felt. It was about how other people treated me and considered me, that you then realize, okay, so I'm going to have to get involved here, because even though I don't think there's a problem, you are definitely treated differently. And that was my kind of first deep sigh, that you're going to have to do this. And I think for most people that I know in the NHS who have a different racial background to the majority, you kind of have to take it on the chin that there's an extra 20% of your time that's spent dealing with this kind of stuff. You become by default the person who is expected to have a view, expected to have an opinion, and probably not just an opinion, but an educated opinion on equality, diversity, and inclusion matters. It's kind of the tax that you pay almost. What was really interesting to me, the last 5 years was, Black Lives Matters was huge.
Yeah.
And the echo of that, through to Britain, through to the public services, was really interesting. And for a moment, there was a point at which you thought, this is really fascinating. Things are going to change. What's really interesting to me was it's impossible to know as a black individual whether the benefits that are accrued to you personally as a result of those kind of societal movements are because people are wanting to change the way that they behave, or because you're suddenly just very useful optically. So you're asked to be on boards, or you're asked to be on panels, you're asked to speak at conferences. And you're left not knowing if that's because actually people are rebalancing their decision making, or because you're suddenly very useful. And
because you tick a box.
Yeah, because you tick a box. And actually, there's no way of knowing. There's no way of ever knowing that. So you have to then make a conscious decision to care or not care about that, to turn up or not turn up. But you kind of always got this, I don't know if I'm alone on this, but, a director's commentary in your head about, why am I here? Why am I in this room? Is it legitimate? Is it earned? Am I actually solving somebody else's problem by being visible in this room? So it doesn't really help, I guess. But I think what's been more interesting than that is, over the years that have followed, you felt that retraction away from Black Lives Matters. We have now probably gone full circle, I'd say, to the backlash. And so I'm very interested to see what happens next. I'm very interested to see, politically where this country goes, where the world goes, let's face it, and how much we can retain and how much we lose from what was probably won over the last 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was speaking to somebody who I won't name, but from Sheffield Theatres, and they were talking about going to the World Cup in the United States, and they are black, and their husband does not want to. He's fearful of staying in the United States. They're going to stay in Canada and then go to the games when they're in the US. And as a white middle-aged man, I cannot get my head around that. But I could when I was talking to them, I could see how, they were talking about going to a wedding, and they just they planned it so they could just go and then leave, so they didn't even have to stay there.
Yeah.
I can't, I think you're right. I think particularly what's happening in the US now, I think we have come full circle.
Yeah.
And the whole ICE thing, and and the politics here, it does appear that we are going into a new phase of this, and it really confuses me.
Yeah, I chair, or actually just stepped down actually from chairing for many years the Black Leaders Network of the NHS. That's a national organisation, and I kind of gave my final speech to them a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things I said was, it was probably easier to do this job in 2020 than it is now, but actually it's more important to do the job now. Back in 2020, when you had big national global brands wanting to swing behind the movement, wanting to show their allegiances, I think it was a safe space. But actually, the time to be a leader on these issues is now, when it's really quite tricky, and that's when the voices need to be heard more than ever.
Is there institutional racism in the UK today?
Yes.
And what does it look like? How does it play out? What actually happens?
I think what it looks like, this is the thing, it's very hard to put your finger on it, which is why it's allowed to exist. I think you can only look at it when you zoom back and look at the macro demographics of people in power. I think that's for me in the NHS, for example, and I forget the actual number now, but for many, many years, there's been 5 or 6 black chief executives total out of 300, 350 chief executives in the NHS, whatever the number is. That's waxed and waned, but it's never really got above 10. And that's not because of competence. So you just have to just say, there's a question mark here. There's an issue here. People get to certain levels. You look at the various banding across the NHS, and you look at the ethnicity of people in the lower bands compared to the ethnicity of people in the higher bands, and think there's only one argument that accounts for this, and that's because the NHS is endemically racist. Yeah. So it just is, and I think the same argument can be levelled across society. Whatever group you want to pick, black managers in the Premier League, it doesn't really matter. You just say, look at the black footballers, look at the black managers, explain to me why we're not converting more from that pool of talent. What's the other rationale why it could be so?
Yeah, it's diversity and inclusion the problem needs to get tackled lower down. So, for example, there's a move which is a good move, which is to get more women and people of color onto board of directors in public companies. In order to have the skills to be on a public company board, you need to have done what you've done and become a senior manager in an organization at chief executive level, ideally, or chief financial officer level. But what happens, because the institutions don't make those moves, don't put people like you into those positions, you don't have enough people that are qualified. So it becomes a box ticking exercise, which is super annoying, because the problem is much lower down.
There's a pipeline problem.
Yes,
absolutely, and absolutely. And not only that, though, I think there's also a networking problem. So those people do exist, but their networks sometimes don't overlap with the networks of the people who are looking. Yeah, and I think that's the other bit that needs solving.
Yeah, well, it's your thing. How'd you get a job at the BBC? You don't look at the Guardian, because they're just pretend jobs. Yeah. You've actually got to know somebody that works at the BBC. Yeah, it's a hard problem, but a necessary one to overcome. Do you think, because you've spoken out, do you think you've been discriminated against because you do speak about it?
It's certainly a risk.
Yeah.
And I'd be lying if I said it wasn't in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that I said when I was ending my term as chair of the Black Leaders Network was, there are some phenomenal black leaders in the NHS who I have, stood on the shoulders of and admired. And it's their bravery and courage about speaking out. People like Lord Victor Adebowale and people like that, who have given me confidence to speak out. So I guess the answer is, who knows? You'll never ever know, and that's kind of part of the problem. But what I would say is, my guess is that I have done enough to reach, with a huge degree of visibility, to reach the position I'm in.
Yeah.
Which would mean that it's unlikely.
Yeah, yeah. When was the first time? What was the inflection point where you decided, actually, I'm going to talk about this? I am going to.
Yeah. John, honestly, I think it was 2019, 2020. So it was just before Black Lives Matter, actually. And I kind of had a personal realization, and I remember where I was. I was in a tent in Wales, and I'd kind of realized that I'd done loads of stuff around race and black leadership and all that kind of stuff, and I'd done loads of stuff around innovation, and I'd never really put those two things together. And I realized that actually I was probably missing part of my leadership, I suppose, duty in terms of just speaking out about what I saw in terms of how race has a role to play in terms of where we focus our research funding, where we focus our innovation priorities. And probably I was one of the people in the country who should be having, or should be giving more of a voice to this. So I thought I'd better do something about it. And I created a national campaign about diversity and innovation and why it's important and what the business case is for that. And actually what happened then, it was, of course, the pandemic and Black Lives Matters at the same time. And that's when you started to see some of the stuff I was talking about. We have pulse oximetry meters, the kind of things you clip onto the end of your fingers that aren't actually good for black skin. They don't work. And yet we were clipping them onto black skin in the early days of the pandemic, and nobody had any idea that they didn't work on black skin because they hadn't been tested on black people.
Oh, God. You're kidding me.
No. Something gets that far down an R&D route before somebody says, does this work for everybody or just for some people? And that's the kind of stuff I was talking about with my work on diversity and innovation. It wasn't just about a moral crusade. It was about the fact that we could be inadvertently killing people because we've got books about different skin blemishes that are just showing what things look like on white skin. And people are being taught on those textbooks. And AI is now being taught on those models. So, we're in danger of creating or recreating our biases in terms of how we teach people medicine and how we create the medical technologies that help our population to be healthy.
That's the best, one of the best examples of bias I've ever heard. And how dangerous is that?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Thanks for speaking so candidly about that. I didn't expect you to actually, but it's like my brain's whirring now. Let's just talk a little bit about what comes next. So, if we execute perfectly, what does healthcare look like in 2035?
Yeah, I mean, if we execute perfectly, gosh, it's science fiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, the future's already here, actually. It's just not evenly distributed. I think there's a really fascinating conversation happening at the moment with, some great people on the new hospitals program. They're trying to design these new hospitals thinking, what do we need to put in them? It's like, good luck with that. Because I don't think I can tell you what they need to look like in the next 2 years, then by the next 10 years, because we probably will need a bed.
Yeah.
But after that, and probably decent Wi-Fi, but who knows? I mean, the possibilities are endless. I think where I'd see it going is, I would hope, is a massive move towards personalization.
Yeah.
So I think, we are going to, I think, be at the end of giving drugs out at the population level without really knowing how it affects people depending on their genetic makeup. And I think so tailored, personalized, produced drugs and other types of novel intervention, I think, will be par for the course. Obviously, genetic medicine will come to the fore without a doubt. But I also think that shift towards prevention. I mean, I think we're going to have to get into the realms of personal and, citizens' incentives.
Yeah.
What's the tax incentive for someone to keep their BMI below 25? What we're talking about, outlawing cigarettes for a generation, maybe the 15-year-olds of today. Why not keep going? Why not say, actually, make that generation and all generations that come beyond them the healthiest generation and incentivize them to maintain that? But I think in terms of tech, it's going to be about assisted living. It's going to be about AI health coaches. It's going to be about wearables. I don't think they'll be on your wrist anymore, or maybe not even on your finger, but, so God knows where they'll be. But it's going to be about wearables or implantables, and it's going to be about having personalized approaches to what you do every day to keep yourself healthy. And if you do break, then I think it's going to be about, really cutting edge hospitals that are just there to get you back on your feet. But it's really exciting.
Are there any discussions about humanoid robots entering hospitals?
Are there any discussions? None, I'm sure there are. None that I'm aware of. I mean, I think, coming back to the regulation points we made earlier, there's certainly conversations about, care responsibility.
Yeah.
Humanoid robots in terms of care homes, yes.
Yeah.
Humanoid robots in terms of private homes and
Yeah.
keeping people out of hospital, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've obviously got robotic surgeons already.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's, but so I think it's coming.
Yeah.
But specifically in hospital settings, I think apart from surgeons, no, I've not heard anything.
Because the Tesla models they're building in Fremont, California, are like $15,000 at the moment. I mean, by the time that they come to market, more like $5,000 probably. And when you get artificial general intelligence, the possibilities of this stuff are just off the charts. What happens if we don't get it right? What does it look like?
Genuinely, I think from an NHS point of view, I think if we don't get it right, we are gonna have to have a conversation about what the NHS is for, and what's affordable. The NHS is society's safety net, and I could see us starting a political conversation, probably outside the NHS, but in government, about what a core universal healthcare provision looks like and what needs to be wrapped around it. I also think we'll be incredibly vulnerable to disruptors.
Yeah.
So, whether it's Google or whoever coming in and saying, actually, we've got an offer here that's going to just, perhaps do what you should have done, but we're going to do it from the outside in. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts about, does disruption ever happen internally, or is it always an external who comes along to disrupt? Because at the moment, I think the NHS is trying to disrupt itself. But whether it gets to or not, I think, before somebody comes and disrupts it, I think is probably my question to you.
Artificial intelligence changes everything, changes the assumptions on absolutely everything. The commoditization of knowledge is you've reversed this interview. You're now interviewing me. That's classic for a media guy. The commoditization of knowledge and intelligence is super dangerous and super interesting all at the same time. And people don't understand what that actually means. If you're a task or you're following a rule book, AI is going to do it better than you.
Yeah.
How much of what happens in the NHS is a task or based on a rule book? Probably quite a lot. So the NHS needs to fundamentally change, and the speed at which AI is going means if it doesn't, somebody will, Amazon, who are already making moves in this area, or somebody will appear and commoditize it like that. Yeah. And the NHS needs to think about what that means. And I think it probably needs to do what Hewlett-Packard did when it needed to invent a new type of printer. They had to say to the guys, go completely into a different geographic region, do not talk to us, and just build it from scratch. And I suspect the only way that the NHS can really do it, given all the constraints that you've been talking about, is something like that. You pick a region and you say, just build this entire thing from scratch. And everybody else will then look at this because life expectancy, outcomes, costs, all these things will be fundamentally different.
It's really interesting to say that, because I mean, that's part of the 10-year plan, this idea about innovation zones. How can you actually have some kind of vanguard areas that are just given a bit of permission to go off and do? And I think that's part of the experiment is, what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
And then how can it be replicable? But certainly for me, it's got to be about, it's got to be about prevention. It's got to be about reducing the tax burden on citizens for the NHS, and it's got to be about social care. We've not talked about social care, but for everything I've said about the NHS and the ability that technology has got to solve it, then social care, absolutely is in the same breath.
So if you sort of had the magic wand question, if you had full control of everything,
yes,
and you could do one thing that would massively impact the NHS, what would it be?
I will do myself out of a job. But quite happily, actually, if I could wave that wand, and it is going to be about the mandation of the uptake of proven evidence-based innovation. That, I think, is the thing I would say. If we could just get the NHS to a point where the amazing things that comes out of our universities, the amazing things that come out of our National Institute for Health Research are adopted at speed and in the hands of clinicians and patients as fast as humanly possible, I think that would make a step change in our ability to deliver care and the outcomes that our patients get. So rather than me having to schlep around the county asking people to be brave, let's just wave that wand and say, every time we invent something that's game-changing, it gets put into use.
Well, that's a brilliant way to end. And I have to say, Richard, that was absolutely fascinating. The particularly how candid you were about your own experiences with race, and fascinating. That was Richard Stubbs, a leader working at the point where healthcare, technology, economics, and regional identity collide. Someone arguing that innovation is not a luxury for the NHS. It's one of the few credible paths towards a healthier population, a stronger economy, and a more productive country. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow The Digital Forge on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.
You know the kind of conversations we have here, honest, ambitious, and focused on what's really shaping the future of UK industry. Now, imagine taking them even further. That's exactly what the Digital Forge membership is about. This isn't just another network, it's a proving ground where connection, knowledge, and opportunity collide. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive events and curated networking with serious builders, a private community platform for real-time support, and a content and knowledge hub packed with insights you won't find anywhere else. Plus, you'll gain access to exclusive discounts and the chance to learn directly from mentors and seasoned founders who've already walked the path. Everything we do is built on trust, clarity, and intent. No noise, no theatre, just the right conditions for progress. So if you're ready to join the future of UK industry and step into a community built to accelerate growth, join other members at forgedforgrowth.com.